when I turn this thing on again, that grandfather's clock sounds off. Well, the people then on Meridian Street said it was probably Providence. They put it down as Providence. It seems that Jimmy, the father of little Rosanna, was shot in a fight. There was a fight over, it was a gambling fight, and well, that was ended Jimmy. But everybody knew that old man Dunker wouldn't go to the funeral, and he wouldn't put up 1 cent. Not 1 cent did he contribute to the final funeral of Jimmy. Well, of course, nobody else had any money, and it seems that the people he'd worked for, Mr. Wenger and the grocery man and the butcher, and I suppose his gambling friends, they contributed enough to get a decent funeral for Jimmy. Well, I suppose that eliminated Jimmy forever, but everybody, of course, disgusted with old man Dunker, who had become more and more a recluse than ever before. The shutters of the house hung on one hinge, and many of them that hadn't been painted in years, and the garden was, well, it had just stopped growing, I think, it just on its share of leaves and rubbish, and it was nice. So, well, by this time it didn't bother people so much because they pointed it out as something funny. It was a kind of show place. It was, you know, like this old house, you know, it was ghostly, it was weird. On this one house amongst all these beautiful houses, you know, painted and beautiful lawns, and here was this old house, and there was that pathetic stag that little Jimmy, when he was a little boy, used to ride on, and with his leg still broken, and it was leaning over now to one side, and people thought, well, my goodness, if they could only have that fixed. But old man Dunker was still living on tripe and liver and pigs and cow's heart, and I don't suppose they ever changed. At any rate, the Jimmy finally was laid away, but nobody ever saw anything more of Dunker, except he emerged now and again. He was more bent than ever and more crippled than ever, although nobody exactly knew just what was the matter with him. Shirley there, as we were sitting on this veranda there under these coconut trees and on this hacienda there, she said, you know, she said, I always predicted that that ladies auxiliary, they would get their comeuppance, you know, they were too bossy. See, they'd never run into any trouble until Mayor Hickok came, and of course he had stopped them in a few places, but they never really had a real comeuppance. But little did they know that it was about to happen. Etebunna was more popular than ever, and but a rumor got out. In fact, it was more than a rumor, it was news that some of the young blades of the people of Meridian Street Society, young ones, the young fellows, had been seen coming out of Etebunna's house late at night. Well, nobody could really believe that. That was almost incredible. Etebunna, this woman of impeccable character. Well, the ladies auxiliary, of course, had to call a meeting on that. They didn't say anything. They were become very cautious. Well, they had what you would call a full-dress meeting. Well, they decided it was very dangerous to take something like that for granted and interfere, so they decided to hire a private eye to look into the background of Etebunna. Well, they were so spiteful, you know, and also to case the house. I think they call it on a stakeout. I don't know what they call it. There's some funny words they use in television about anyhow, the private eye was paid a great deal of money. All the ladies' aid, they had plenty of money, of course. By that time they were richer than ever, you know. What with industry had come, you know, to Indianapolis and the neighboring towns and natural gas. Well, anyhow, the private eye, first thing he did was to, after several weeks of research, sent in a report. It seems, well, it was most astonishing. It was extra private and delivered to Mrs. Pott Hemus, and just for the ladies auxiliary. Well, it seems that Etebunna was the daughter of a New Orleans prostitute who ran a well-known house of prostitution in New Orleans. That is Etta Bunner's mother. Etta Bunner was born in this house of prostitution, father unknown, of course, but she lived there until she was a sort of a helper, you know, a step-and-fetch-it little girl, you know, very useful around a whorehouse, I suppose. And but when she got to the age where gentlemen began to look at her, you know, like gentlemen are, you know, I mean, a chick of that type, and in such a house, well, and mind you, little Etta Bunner at that time was you can imagine. Well, the mother who ran this house decided to send Etta Bunner away. She didn't want Etta Bunner to follow in her footsteps, although she was doing good business. Well, Etta seemed to be farmed out, according to the report of the Private Eye, to a cousin, or a sister, I think, of this woman, and she brought her up as a fine dressmaker and in very respectable surroundings. There was no doubt about that. Well, apparently when the mother died, the house was sold and Etta Bunner got the money. Well, it seems that she had it in the bank. Little did anybody know that Etta Bunner had little. It wasn't a big amount, but it was the proceeds from the whorehouse, you see. And well, nobody knew that, but this was in the report of the Seeing Eye, and she had come up to, picked Indianapolis as a respectable Middle Western town, set up a shingle there, Etta Bunner dressmaker. Well, that was the beginning. Then the report came in that, oh yes, numerous young blades, young gentlemen, the blue bloods, they'd been seen emerging from Etta Bunner's house, different times, different night, and well, that was a red flag to a bull, you might say, to the ladies' auxiliary, to think that there should be such a canker in their midst, such a cancer, such a sore, anything, how dreadful. Their sons, their young sons. Well, they read the report over, and in fact there was intimations that there were some others beside the sons that had been seen, but there wasn't too much on that. And at any rate, this was a decision for the ladies' auxiliary to act. This was a sort of prima facie. This was their biggest case ever. Now, I couldn't deny it. I mean, there was the evidence of what the detectives, the Seeing Eye, had reported, and well, they decided to keep the matter strictly private because it would be count against them. So they figured the best thing to do was to attend to Etta Bunner. Well, the meeting was to be, some men had to be taken into it. Well, I told you, as Shirley said, my daddy was sometimes asked about legal matters. He'd warned them about talking about colored blood in people, and he'd warned them about certain things they couldn't do, and not to be too officious because, you know, they could be sued, and they didn't like that, of course. You know, the ladies' auxiliary felt that they were beyond being sued by any common people, you know, that what they should decide to do was, of course, obviously right. Weren't they the leaders of society? Well, at any rate, Daddy had cautioned them on that. Well, this time the posse was arranged. Some of the men were there, and they went down to Etta Bunner's place. It was in the early morning. Well, the old Pothemus was the spokeslady, the spokeswoman. She told Etta Bunner, she said, I'm not going into details, but she says, we have the knowledge, the report, and it's beyond contradiction. They gave Etta Bunner 24 hours to get out of town and stay out. Otherwise, they would strip her naked, smear her with tar and feathers, and ride her out of town on a gate. That was the decision of the ladies' auxiliary. And they left. Well, it seems that Etta Bunner had many friends. The moving man with big trucks came, and everybody pitched in. Well, by less than 24 hours, Etta Bunner and dear little Rosanna gone. Well, they moved to a little nearby town. I'm not going to mention it, but it was a prosperous town. Etabana had a lawyer, and it seems that she bought this house in this little town. It was a progressive town because they were opening up a pipe factory, a glass factory, and a iron stove factory, and I don't know what else. And the house was a great bargain, so Etabana moved in there with little Rosanna, hung up a shingle, Etabana, dressmaker. Well, now the ladies had succeeded, ladies auxiliary, the canker had been removed, but it was often reported that cars of the ladies auxiliary had been seen in front of this house for their dresses. They had boo-boos, that dangled here and there, and they had hard to fit a blouse, and Etabana was their dressmaker, she knew, and well, at any rate, that was just hearsay. At any rate, Etabana was gone, and Rosanna was gone, and she was doing very well in this little town. The ladies were making cock-a-doodle-doo, as the French say. They'd succeeded in getting rid of this incubus. I'd come home from the east, it was getting near Christmas, and it seems that the ladies auxiliary were having a most important meeting. It was about Christmas time and charity and the festivities, and they were having a meeting in Mrs. Pothimus's house, and a lot of the men were coming along because it was quite important. So there were not just the women, there were some 12 or 15 there, people had arrived, and it was going to be a kind of festivity. They were going to have a little discussion about the charity, and they were going to have a few drinks and a little jollification, and it was a fateful afternoon, I guess, but who could foresee? Pothimus himself was lying stretched out on the sofa. He had a glass by the side of him. He'd had a little snifter before the party was to come, but there he was lying there, and well, he had just dozed off to sleep. In fact, he was really fast asleep, and well, everybody filed in. It was their usual big room where they met, and Pothimus was lying down there, and so Mrs. Pothimus says, well, now he only just dozes off, he'll be up in a moment, and we'll start the meeting. And then, well, it happened. It's Pothimus. He was in his sleep, fast asleep. He said, oh, Etabana, oh, that's wonderful, oh, Etabana, oh, don't stop, oh, Etta, oh, you're so beautiful, oh, Etta, it's wonderful, oh, don't stop. Well, they all heard it. Everybody heard it, looking at him. What more he added, we don't know. Mrs. Pothimus rushed over to him, grabbed him by the hair, and slapped his face. Poor Pot woke up. Well, he says, what's going on? Well, everybody hightailed it out. You were sure they weren't going to get on anything like that. They'd all heard enough. And, well, they hightailed it out and made a wild dash for their limousines, and they were gone. That was the end. Well, we don't know exactly what happened, but it seems that Mrs. Pothimus subpoenaed the papers of that seeing eye because he'd lose his license, as they claimed. Daddy said if he didn't submit them, well, he submitted the report, the seeing eye report. Well, it included not only Mr. Pothimus, who of course the seeing eye had been wise enough not to disclose. Oh, he had been there many times. A lot of other very prominent gents, not the young blades. Of course, there was nothing that Mrs. Pothimus could do. Pothimus himself had to go to the east, of course he was separated. It was going to be a divorce. Well, there was big alimony involved, and it was one of the divorces had been then. They were becoming a little more popular in Indianapolis at the time. Well, the divorce was set, and of course, eventually, Mrs. Pothimus got the divorce. Well, now, that isn't exactly the end of the story. You see, it seems that it was a little while later, it had been a very, very cold, a beastly cold winter. It was March, and they'd had a frightful storm, and, well, it was in downtown Indianapolis. An icicle had fallen together with a big piece of stone from a roof of a building, and it fell slap bang on the head of somebody, and well, they were killed immediately, lying on the street. And well, it's very odd. They took this person to the morgue, and the police found out that it was old man Dunker. Oh, there he was, definitely him. Killed us, dead as a doornail. Well, in his pocket they found a will, a perfectly well-drawn will with the names of the lawyers, and it was, they called the lawyers up. Yes, they said, we're waiting for a man, Mr. Dunker, to come. He's going to sign the will. Well, the will was unsigned, therefore it was not legal, but the lawyers said that the will made out was leaving everything he had to hospitals in the South and institutions, and nothing to any individual, not a cent, only to these institutions in the South. Well, the will was unsigned. So Daddy, when we were talking about it, said, well, you know, that will is no good. Well, it seems that Etta Bunner heard about it, and of course she came to Daddy, and well, Daddy said, well, I don't like to interfere in this, but seeing that I've known this person, and well, he took the case. Well, of course, little Rosanna was the heir, the sole heir, you see. The will, the fortune left behind was over $600,000 at that time. Oh, tremendous estate. So he was a miser, this old man. $600,000 in gilt-edged securities and real estate. Well, little Rosanna was the sole heir, according to what Daddy said, and of course, Rosanna came into possession of $600,000, which my daddy at that time said was he thought much more valuable, but that was what it was rated at. And this little kid, she was growing up now, of course, she was quite big, and she decided to give Etta Bunner, who had befriended her, half. Well, so Etta Bunner got half, and Rosanna took the other half of this vast fortune. And well, of course, Etta Bunner decided to take Rosanna to the south of France. And well, they went to the south of France. Of course, everybody heard about them, but well, it was a kind of enigma, wasn't it? I mean, they'd chased her out of town on the tar and feather threat, and well, of course, everybody was glad that to hear the end of old man Dunker. He lived longer than any of them, you know. And well, at last he was gone, and the house belonged to Rosanna and Etta Bunner, and of course they promptly put it up for sale. You can imagine that, and it was bought by a very wealthy organization, and of course that was the end of the eyesore. They fixed the shutters and cleaned the garden up, and maybe fixed the poor stag his leg, and at any rate it was refurbished, and that was the house. Well, you know, time went on. I was through there with the East. I'd come home, and I'd lived in Egypt for a while. This was Shirley, you know, and I was with her in Egypt, by the way. That's we got talking about our trip to Luxor. You know, that's down where the Valley of the Kings, and well, there we were sitting on the veranda there in the plantation there, the coconut plantation in the Philippines, and I said, well, what actually happened? Well, you know, she said, there was an ending to it, you see. That terrible comeuppance that Mrs. Pott got, you know, well, that really broke up the ladies' auxiliary. I mean, they all after that, they couldn't hold their heads up, you know, they disbanded, and anyhow, it didn't go anymore, you know. They were too social minded, you know. They were radio and coming, and they didn't go in much for that civic virtue stuff anymore, you know, those nosy women. And well, it seems that eventually Etta Bunner and Rosanna came back, and of course Etta Bunner at that time was about 32 or something like that. Of course, she didn't have her hair in a bun anymore. She was just a raving beauty, a young heiress, of course, Etta Bunner. She came back to Indianapolis, by the way, and she was a great beauty. Of course, little Rosanna was about 20, also an heiress too, and pretty as a picture, you can imagine. Well, here were these two women, and after all, Etta Bunner was young and with a fortune. It was estimated now at $750,000 between the two of them, and well, of course, many many of the society women there had sons, you know, that were eligible, you know. They want to marry them off, good. Well, of course, they had also some older sons that would have been, well, you know, Etabana was very desirable at that age, maybe up to 32 or something like that. And, well, of course, there was always this background, this, you know, story about what had happened. And, well, Etabana and Rosanna, they took a very beautiful estate there. They rented it, and of course they got lots of letters. Well, it was a very funny thing. Etabana hired a woman there for a social secretary that knew all about society. Well, all invitations from anybody that had ever belonged to the ladies' auxiliary, they were never even answered. The letters were never even answered. Letters of invitation, of course, but some of the newcomers, new industrialists that had come there, and when they invited Rosanna and Etabana, they went nicely, to the best, of course. They were very nice, and of course, well, people were raving about them, you know. But all those poor ladies' auxiliary, when they never even, I mean, they were out, you know. They had maybe plenty of offsprings, and maybe there were a goodly number of divorced men there, you know. But, well, they never even answered any of their letters, and they were definitely snubbed. Well, there was an ending, as Shirley told me. She said, you know, because Etabana, she never forgave them, you know. She never forgave, you might say, Indianapolis. I think she just came back to sort of rub salt in their wounds, in a way. There was a new doctor came to town. He's a very handsome young man, about 30, 32, very prominent surgeon. And he hung out his shingle in Indianapolis, I suppose, very much like poor little Etabana had hung out a dressmaker's shingle some years before. But this doctor was reported to be very wealthy and single, of course. Well, of course, then there was he was a target, you know, for the man, you know, for many of these widows and young daughters, you know. Well, of course, they all had their aim on him, you know. He was very important. Well, to add to the cup of sorrow, their bitterness, Shirley said, what do you think happened? I said, well, I don't know, but I can imagine. Etabana eloped with the doctor, the $1 million new doctor that everybody thought was so wonderful. And little Rosanna went along. And they went on a round-the-world honeymoon, and Etabana with the doctor, the very fine surgeon, and little Rosanna lived in New York, this very smart suburb of New York. And Etabana and Rosanna wiped the dust of Indianapolis off their feet. I said, Shirley, I said, when she told, she said it was so many incidents that could be added. She said, but, you know, it's a funny story, she said, because I remember, you know, things that used to go on. It's very clear in my mind, but she said that's as much as I can remember. I mean, that's a bare outline of the story. I said, well, Shirley, I think it's a terribly funny story, but I said, only that could only happen in a town like Indianapolis. I said, at least I'm saying that now, I hope I don't offend anybody by relating this yarn, but I'm not responsible for it. It was Shirley's story. I was never there, so you couldn't blame me for it, but that's the story, as far as I can remember, that was told to me by Shirley on my veranda of my hacienda there, my coconut plantation just outside of Manila. I'm sorry to say that about a year and a half later, dear Shirley passed away. She was, as I say then, 79, world traveler. She'd been everywhere, done everything, I suppose, and what people like her do, you know. She was a very literary and artistic type of person, and we should come back to me, I think she must have had a kind of premonition that she wasn't to live much longer, and I'd been a lifetime friend of hers for 40 years, so she came out to me there to my hacienda. It was very warm and beautiful. Of course, we had lots of servants and didn't have to have anybody pay anybody. We took care of her there, you know. Well, she passed away. It was 1 August, I think, and when she was well, she was well on in 79, so I thought to myself, well, she never worked all her life. Her father left her enough money, and she had a good time all her life, and I don't say she spent much of her life in Indianapolis. It was mostly in the south of France or in Japan or in smart places in Europe or Monte Carlo, or a great deal of time in New York City, because I was living in New York City at the time, in Greenwich Village. And so you see, she had a very happy life, and well, that's what she said, well, this is my Indiana story.